This new Blood Surge build is the best Necromancer build that has ever existed in the history of this game. I have pushed this build all the way up to a 93, which puts it as one of the highest pick clear builds in the game. This build absolutely obliterates bosses, but most importantly, the thing that makes this build so much better than every other Necro build that's ever existed is the insane speed that this build can farm at. I was able to complete a 2-minute pit 70. There has never been a 2-minute pit in the history of Necromancer, let alone one as high as his 70. This build does insane damage, it's ridiculously mobile, it's completely unkillable, it obliterates bosses, and it's the best farming build that's ever existed. This is the Necromancer build for Season 6, and this build is completely broken. There's 3 different things that make this build so absurdly good for speed farming. The first is just the incredible area of effect on Blood Surge. It's hitting the entire screen with every cast, dealing billions of damage to every single mob on the screen, allowing you to obliterate everything at insane speeds. The second piece is that we're able to hit 200% movement speed while we're in combat. This means we are running around at the maximum amount of movement speed possible, allowing us to quickly traverse the dungeon. And the final, most important, and newest piece is this new rune word combination, Tam Ja, which allows us to cast a Sork teleport after we cast Blood Surge 16 times, which 16 Blood Surge casts might seem like a lot, but at this attack speed, I am proccing this rune word like every 2 to 3 seconds. It is absolutely ridiculous how often I'm able to teleport, as you can see from the gameplay footage. And so I am able to clear extremely hard content insanely fast, and this is the most efficient build for farming, whether you want to do bossing, if you want to do pits, if you want to do nightmare dungeons, infernal hordes. This is the best Necromancer build for all of those forms of content. Now, there is a huge misnomer that Blood Surge's single target sucks, and this is completely wrong. In fact, if anything, Blood Surge struggles the most on white mobs. It absolutely annihilates bosses, and that is because of the +7 drains from elites on Courier's Embrace. This represents a ginormous damage multiplier, and is the most important stat on your Courier's Embrace if you want to delete any elite and any boss that you see. This allows the build to absolutely destroy bosses, killing them in mere seconds. Now, we do need to talk about some new things with the build that have completely changed from old versions of the build. The first new piece is absolutely insane, which is the Heir of Perdition. This one aspect is giving me, this one item right now with my masterworks and stuff is giving me 40% crit chance, 40% lucky hit, 30% movement speed, plus 4 to core skills, and a 60% damage multiplier. This unique is absolutely broken, and it's a fantastic replacement to the Lucian. If you played the old version of the build, we were playing like Lucian, Banished Lords, and had this whole cool combo going, but due to some changes, this ends up being significantly better than that old version. The increased lucky hit damage is actually a huge multiplier for our single target because we're able to generate so many more corpses, and if you're not familiar with the engine of the build, if you didn't play this build last season, we're going to be eating every corpse that we spawn with Courier's Embrace. We're going to be turning those corpses into blood orbs with the Embalmer, and that synergy is going to be proccing tons of huge multipliers from our Paragon, as well as a bunch of other pieces of the build, so the lucky hit ends up adding tremendous amounts of damage. On top of that, we're also going to be playing the Ring of Starless Skies because, again, attack speed, crit chance, lucky hit, ranks and core skills, and a huge multiplier. These 2 uniques are giving us huge amounts of lucky hit, and that's where we get into this question of when should you swap to Blood Surge. My opinion is that Blood Surge is not worth playing without Starless Skies. You can play it before you get Starless Skies, but I think Starless Skies really enables this build, and honestly, Heir of Perdition super enables it. This build that we're talking about is the Giga super chat in-game Necromancer build that you're striving to build for. I would recommend you play a different build until you get these mythics, but if you can still do Torment 4 without the mythics, it's just going to be a lot harder. But if you want that, and linked in the description is the build with no mythics. But let's keep going with the Mythic Unique build. So the Blood Orb synergies, the aspect of Embalmer, the corpse consumption, what is all of that fueling? One of the biggest pieces is Rathma's Vigor. Rathma's Vigor is going to make it so that every 12 seconds our next blood skill is going to guarantee overpower, but every time we pick up a Blood Orb, we're going to reduce that cooldown by 2 seconds. Now, when we're hitting tons of enemies, right, and remember, we're getting the extra drains on elites, so we're hitting elites 8 times per cast, then the Nova hit, so that's 9 times, plus we're playing the Bloodbathe aspect, so we're hitting every elite 10 times with my current gear. In Perfect Gear, you're going to be hitting every elite 11 times, and every single one of those hits has its own lucky hit, and they can all proc Hued Flesh for increased corpse generation. Then those corpses get automatically consumed by Courier's Embrace, which procs Embalmer, which turns the corpses into blood orbs. We pick up the blood orbs, and that resets the cooldown on Rathma's Vigor. Obviously, as well, whenever we kill enemies, it's also going to respawn corpses that we eat, and so we're getting huge damage from that. And if you go into our Paragon here, we have Flesh Eater, where after we eat 5 corpses, we get 40% damage for 6 seconds. And again, in AoE, this is easily 100% uptime. And in single target, this uptime is actually surprisingly high, like 50%. And then if we come over here, we have Blood Begets Blood, which is whenever we pick up a Blood Orb, we get a 10% damage multiplier, which stacks up to 5 times for 50% damage. And you can start to see why this engine is so powerful. Every time we pick up a Blood Orb, we're proccing the Blood Begets Blood for 50%, and we're resetting the cooldown on Wrath's Vigor, allowing us to overpower ginormous amounts of times per second. And because this build has so much attack speed, and it hits so many times every single cast, we are proccing the heck out of Lucky Hit. So our corpse generation is ginormous. On top of that, we're also going to be running Paranormal Blood Surge, which is going to make it so after every 5 overpowers on Blood Surge, every 5 casts of Blood Surge, we get a guaranteed overpower. And because we're attacking like 4 times a second, 5 times a second, this gets procced crazy fast. And between that and the Wrath's Vigor, you can see from the gameplay, we are consistently overpowering, and every time we overpower, we delete the entire screen. The next new piece of the build is Soul Rift. Soul Rift allows us to play with no resource generating aspect, no sources of vulnerable, and absolutely no damage reduction, because this one ability solves all of those problems. You can see by default it's going to give you a huge amount of barrier and a huge amount of essence per second, more than enough to pay for your blood surges, and enough barrier to make you completely unkillable. On top of that, this effect, by the way, is also tripled against bosses, so even in single target, this is going to generate enough essence and barrier to completely sustain you. Now, Supreme Soul Rift is also going to give you a 30% damage multiplier, and this buff persists after Soul Rift ends, which is completely insane. And then finally, Soul Rift is going to apply Vulnerable, and it's going to give us a chance on hit to absorb their soul. And of course, we're hitting 10 to 11 times per cast per elite. So if there's 3 or 4 elites, you can start to see why this is so ridiculous. We're generating absurd amounts of barrier per second, absurd amounts of essence per second, and the build becomes completely online very easily. Now, there is an important stat that we need on gear to fully enable this, which is Soul Rift duration. Now, when you're pushing and you're doing really hard content, like I said, I got up to like a 93, I think is my highest clear right now. This build could probably peak at around 100 with perfect gear, but as you start to push up higher and higher, Soul Rift duration is not important, because we're hitting so many times. We're going to be proccing Abhorrent Decrepify like crazy, resetting all of our cooldowns continuously. But when you're farming, because you're going to be one-shotting everything, you're not going to have the same amount of lucky hit procs on Decrepify, and that's where your Soul Rift duration comes in. I would recommend having Soul Rift duration on chest, boots, and your necklace. That way you can guarantee that it never falls off, because when this buff falls off, you're losing huge amounts of damage, huge amounts of resource. It's really important that we keep it up as much as we can. Now, there's some other new stuff we're doing in this build, that, because as you can see, right, we have no uber uniques for defensives, right? So no Harlequin, no Tyraels, which means we're really low on resistances and very low on armor. Yet despite that, I have 1,000 armor and I am res capped. So where is this coming from? Actually, in the Book of the Dead, I am sacrificing warriors. This is extremely abnormal, but this allows me to play with absolutely no resistances on anything and still easily res cap. This ends up being almost 60 all res when you factor in all the bonuses, which is completely insane. And you might be wondering why no crit? Well, it's because the Perdition and the Starless Skies gives you so much crit that I'm able to crit cap without having the Reaper sacrifice. I'm sorry, without having the Skirmisher sacrifice. So I'm able to sacrifice defenders, and then I can run triple skulls in my jewelry, and that allows me to crit cap with the addition of 1 armor roll on my chest piece. And that's it. That's all it takes. I'm armor capped and res capped. Now, if you don't have armor cap yet, it actually doesn't matter. You'll be completely unkillable on tier 4 even without armor cap, so don't fret about it too much, but it is nice to have just to make sure nothing can ever go wrong. And overall, though, that's pretty much the summary of how this build is working. That's a showcase of why it is so strong. And what you can start to see is all these pieces come together, why this build is absolutely annihilating everything. And you can see why I believe this is the strongest Necro build ever. It has the damage, it has the survivability, and has something no build has ever had for Necromancer, which is crazy mobility. Finally, Necromancer has a teleport, and this build takes full advantage of that. And yeah, that's going to do it for today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out, everybody.